Okay, YouTube, today I've got quite a long video for you. So long that I might end up making it two parts. However, don't worry, if it is two parts, then today will be part one, and then tomorrow I'll post part two. I won't keep you waiting a week or so, because trust me, I'm not worth the wait. This story will touch on themes of the rich and the fabulous, but for me, sometimes when you take a look at that person, what you see isn't always what you get. This video will include quite a bit of my own personal opinion. I'll also throw in some humor here or there. There might be some profanity and curse words. Just please keep into mind, it's all fun banter for me. I hope to make you laugh and keep you engaged. I know the subject matter, a lot of them in this genre, certainly they're not laughing matters. I get that, but some stories I try to add it in, just so you can get to know me better. And with that in mind, if you do end up liking this video, please subscribe, follow me on Instagram so I can get to know you all better. And I do have a second channel, so the links for all of that are in the description below. Now, in the mid 60s, Candace Mossler was one of the most well-known socialites in Houston. And I always wondered to myself, what is a socialite? Like, what is the purpose of a socialite? When I look at the definition, essentially someone that likes to socialize and engage in social activities, or as I like to call it, someone with way too much time on their hands. But time is the greatest commodity we have, so if you are able to, engage in social activities all day, then what a wonderful life you have. Now, Candice, she was in her 40s. She was vivacious and full of charm with wavy blonde hair. She had deep blue eyes. She had a surgically carved body. And a lot of the times when she was in the newspapers, her body would be the focus. She had an easy smile and a soft, breathy voice. But it's her house that I found the most staggering. She lived in a 3-story mansion, which in Texas, it's not uncommon, right? But it had a reported 28 bedrooms. 28 bedrooms! I don't even know 28 people. Now, this mansion was located in River Oaks, and it was the city's richest neighborhood. At this mansion, Candace, she threw lavish fundraisers for local charities and arts organizations. Famous musicians such as Chuck Berry, he would perform in the back lawn next to the tennis courts and a steam-heated swimming pool. And during her soirees, Candace, she would make grand entrances in her house on the stairs with the stairway coming down. She would glide down like a bird. She liked to wear high heel pumps, diamond jewelry, and elegant designer dresses that stopped just above her knees. Bless your heart. Thank you for coming. This is what Candace would say when she would greet visitors during these lavish parties. And in conversation, she would tell stories about her 6 children and her husband, Jacques. Jacques himself was a wealthy financier who had interests in banks, loan companies, and insurance brokers. Jacques himself was quite a punchy, tall, slick-back man, and he was 25 years older than Candace. Jacques, however, very rarely went to these lavish parties that Candace would throw. He would rather remain anonymous in the business world. And I think so far you're starting to see a picture of the two individuals in question and the kind of life they lived. Even though Jack had more money than God, for him, it wasn't about the money. It was about power and control and remaining secure. For Candace, she liked the lavish parties. She liked everyone knowing how much money she had. I don't mean that in a bad way. It's just an observation on the two personalities. Jack, instead of spending time with his wife at these parties, he'd rather remain in Miami, where his 3 banks were located. And on the last week of June 1964, that's where Jack was. So during that week, Candace and 4 of their children were visiting him in Key Biscayne. Jack had a luxury oceanfront apartment in the Bay Area, and this again is further testament to the amount of money he had. It literally grew on trees for this guy. The apartment was located in a quiet beach community just a causeway from Miami. The kids enjoyed playing in the pool as they always did. But during that week, Candace said she wasn't feeling well. She went to the hospital 4 times, complaining on what would be described as a nagging migraine headache. Fun fact, I don't think I've ever had a migraine. Now, of these 4 trips, the last of those was on June the 30th, to which she took her children with her. She stopped at a hotel to mail some letters. Then she took the kids for hamburgers at a diner. At the hospital, she received an injection to ease the pain, and then around 4:30 a.m., she and the children returned to the apartment. But when they walked inside, Jack was lying on the floor, wrapped in a blanket. He had been bludgeoned over the head with the blunt objects. They observed that he had around 39 knife marks around the heart and the lung area. This was front page news in both Miami and Houston. Houston millionaire stabbed to death was the headline in the Houston Chronicle. In the newspaper Miami News, millionaire banker slain in Key Biscayne. Now, Candace initially claimed that Jack's wallet was missing, and they also held money near the bathroom in the apartment, and several $100s were missing. She also claimed that her gold and diamond wristwatch was missing. And because of this, the Dade County Sheriff's Department, the detectives who were on the case, they initially treated it as a burglary. But Candace also suggested to the detectives that her husband did make many enemies over the years, from rival bankers to disgruntled ex-employees and resentful customers who had vehicles or appliances repossessed by the bank. And for me, when I did the research and I saw that the crime itself took place with several stab wounds to the chest, especially if it's 39 times, in my mind, this isn't a burglary. My guess would be it was a crime of passion. See, when you're emotionally charged, right, try and think of the scene in your head. If you're emotionally charged, you're not thinking straight, your serotonin levels have gone haywire, right? If you're gonna insert a knife into someone once or twice and steal what they have or something of that nature, fair play. But when you do it over and over and over again, you are letting go of whatever anger you have, whatever pain, whatever hurt you feel. Each insertion, or incision rather, is ridding the anger you're feeling. So for me, so far when I was reading this, to me, this was a crime of passion. Now, what's more interesting, Candace revealed that there were stories that during Jack's trips to Florida, he sometimes invited young men that he'd met on the beach to his apartment. Candace said that during this week that they spent with her husband in Key Biscayne, her husband did receive phone calls from a male individual who had quite a feminine tone. Candace told detectives that Jack may have lived a closeted life and perhaps was attacked by one of his young lovers. Within days, however, detectives discovered that Candace had been leading a clandestine life herself for nearly 2 years. She had been having an affair with her nephew, 22-year-old mobile salesman Melvin Powers. Mel was 6'4" and built like a linebacker. He had high cheekbones, dark eyes, and black hair. And Candace had written each other impassioned love letters. They had trysts at the mansion and the family's ranch just southwest of Houston and the Mosslers' Galveston Beach house. And now if you look at the dynamic between the two, when Jack was away in Florida, he had his fun, and when Candace was at home, she got the D. Now at some point, the detectives gathered that Candace and Mel had devised a plan to do away with Jack, and the whole purpose was so they could get a hold of his multi-million-dollar fortune. Betsy Parrish, who was a former columnist in the Houston Post, she said when she uncovered this story that it was like a great trashy novel had come to life. Candace was beautiful. She lived in this great mansion and she gave away money to worthy causes. She had children that she adored. She could have anything she could possibly want. And then the police announced that she and her lover boy were cold-blooded killers. Now, Mickey Hershowitz, he was a ghostwriter for George Bush and Betty Davis. At the time, in the 60s, he was talking to the media. He described Candace. He went on to say, maybe you can figure her out. I don't know. Mickey said that Candace would stare at me with her blue eyes and tell me in her little girl voice how she tried to live a good life. Candace would tell me she's not a hateful woman. Candace would continuously say, I would never resort to violence. And whenever we met and I left, she would always give me a big hug and always tell me to come back soon. Hershowitz, he wasn't the only writer flummoxed by Candace. It seemed that every reporter who ever interviewed her, and you can imagine someone, a socialite, someone who is well known in the community, they'll have media influence, if you like, but a lot of them did find her delightful. One reporter gushed over her, describing her having ceaseless effervescence, and other reporters described her as great, beautiful, and charming. In other words, she was great at finessing the system. Of course, in a manner common to journalists that day, there was plenty more ink devoted to her looks. She was described as shapely, lissom, and stylishly coiffed, filled with dash and flair. After Candace was interviewed for her nationally syndicated newspaper column, she was characterized as having an appealing little girl lost quality. Hershowitz went on to say that it was hard to imagine that Candace would ever kill anyone. Once you got to know her, this was the sweetest lady in the world. She was so kind, she was so pleasant, she was so friendly, she would never hurt a fly. Now Candace, she didn't grow up with a silver spoon, she was the 6th of 12 children. 12 children. Her father, you rotting rhino. She was born in 1920 in Buchanan, which is a town in the state of Georgia. Her father, or said rotting rhino, his name was Lon Weatherby, and he was a farmer. Candace's mother, Lizzie, she spent much of her adult life pregnant, and the family had no telephone and no radios in the house. All the kids stayed busy with chores, planting crops, picking cotton, and collecting eggs from the chickens. Hershowitz, who looked into the life of Candace, he described the farm as hard scrabble living when the South was still light years behind the North. Candace was an adorable girl. She was also theatrical. Hershowitz managed to interview one of her nieces. One of the nieces says that Aunt Candace, she loved the make-believe. She wore her nightgowns everywhere, even to church. When she got to church and people asked her, why are you wearing a gown? She said that she wanted to dress like a princess. Unfortunately for Candace, when she was 12, her mother Lizzie died while delivering the 13th child. That child was stillborn. And according to family law, her father turned to corned liquor to help cope with the grief. He suffered a mental breakdown and he moved out of Buchanan, leaving the younger children with relatives. Candace essentially, she raised herself, and when she went to high school, her grandfather kept telling her, why don't you go and find a husband? He can take care of you, he can provide for you, he can give you all the care that you need. Due to this, she was introduced to Norman Johnson. He was a family friend and a civil engineer who was 10 years older than her. He was from Alabama. They married in 1939 and Candace was 19 years old. They moved to the city of Anniston and eventually had a son by the name of Norman Jr. But Candace, she was not content on being a homemaker in small town Alabama. So to get out the house, she would volunteer in American organizations and military support groups. Candace and other young women would help host parties for soldiers at Fort Benning in Georgia, about 120 miles away. And at one of those parties, that's where she met Winthrop Rockefeller, who was the son of the New York industrialist John D. Rockefeller. And I think it's fair to say, if you get to know a Rockefeller, you're going to have your fingers in a few pies. Now, before Rockefeller was shipped overseas to help fight in World War II, it is reported that Winthrop Rockefeller and Candace had a relationship. It was said they were close. Very, very close. In fact, in Houston, there was a court case years after, and this is regarding the disposition of the Mossler family estate. And it was revealed that Candace's second child, Rita, her middle name was Rockefeller. So one of the lawyers asked Candace, is Rockefeller the father? To which Candace's lawyers did not allow her to answer. Now, it's unclear whether her husband at the time, Norman, ever knew of her relationship with Winthrop Rockefeller, but in the mid-40s, he moved her and their two children to New Orleans. In New Orleans, Norman got a job as an engineer at a shipyard, but soon their marriage fell apart. Norman eventually moved west in Colorado, and Candace remained in New Orleans. Candace then said, you know what? I'm going to have my own career. I want to be a fashion model. So she quickly found modeling gigs. This included local department stores and some stores that sold lingerie. At one point, she dropped off the kids with her sister and then she took a train to New York where she attended classes at the Barbizon School of Modeling. When she returned home, she opened the Candace School of Modeling and Self-Improvement. Candace then put ads in the local newspaper. She said in these ads that directed at young women, I can help you with your makeup and with your hairstyling. She would help provide tips on streamlining one's figure and prepare them to model in fashion shows. Her aim was to give these young women confidence, grace, poise, and elegance of speech that will make you a person of real distinction. These ads usually included a photo of Candace with a very seductive smile. And to be fair, if she smiled at me like that, I ain't going off to war, I'm staying home. And with this transition, the poor farm girl had now transitioned herself into a big city entrepreneur. And to attract clients, she hosted free seminars on such topics as how to properly wear a woman's hat. On one Easter Sunday, she held a fashion parade where 45 of her students would march up and down Canal Street. She even had like a high school marching band to provide the music. According to Hershkowitz, when he did his research, there were rumors in New Orleans that Candace, as another way to make money, operated as an escort. She was also said to have run an entire outfit of sex workers, and her main source of income was from soldiers who would come back from the war, and each of them would get a female. These encounters would essentially be a dancing lesson. So a soldier would enter the home or the apartment or the store or wherever it took place. They would have a dancing lesson and then it would end in the bedroom, and the soldier could pay this with his GI Bill and just put it down as a dance lesson. And despite these rumors, it didn't hold Candace back. In her mind, she's thinking, my whole life I got married, it didn't work. I grew up in a farm, I lost my mother. I'm going to live life to the fullest. So she decided to get involved in the city's art scene, applying for a volunteer position with the New Orleans Opera. She told the organization executives that she would be more than happy to meet with prominent businessmen and solicit donations. So the executives gladly took her on, and one of the men that she was suggested go target him was Jacques Mossler. Jack, as a boy, had emigrated with his family to Buffalo in New York and eventually made his way to New Orleans, where he opened a used car dealership. You know what they say? Never trust a car salesman. Now, on a separate note, I always found the city Buffalo in New York interesting because I always wondered what part of the buffalo do the wings come from. Now, in 1916, Jack was around 21 years old, and for him to make a profit, he was known for cutting corners. In fact, in 1916, he was arrested for grand larceny. This was due to a doctor's car being stolen, and the car itself was found at Jack's car dealership. Jack's brothers ran the business while he was away during World War I, and when he came home, he sold the business and then got into loans. He opened a small loan company and he began to offer customers who didn't have much credit history or collateral the opportunity to buy automobiles, appliances and furniture at high interest rates. I believe today they call that a loan shark. He also sold mortgages and invested in insurance firms and banks. By the time 27-year-old Candace walked into his office in early 1947, Jack was 52 years old and he was already known to be wealthy. As I said, he had more money than God. Like Candace, he was recently divorced. He was married for 30 years, had 4 daughters, but then left his wife. And during this encounter, when Candace approached him, he wrote a check for $25 and he said, "The opera, it bores me, but it's clear." He was not bored of Candace. A few weeks after this, she was at the Audubon Zoo with her children, and it was said that Jack would like to walk around the zoo during his lunch break. They got to know each other, fell in love, and eventually in 1949, in the month of May, while on a trip to Fort Lauderdale, Jack and Candace got married at a Presbyterian church. And then when they returned to New Orleans, they decided to pack their belongings. Jack had an idea. He wanted to establish a new headquarters for his business empire, and this was in a city neither of them knew well, Houston. Now, in the 1950s, it was said that Houston was awash with money. Houston used money like Niagara Falls used water, and this was predominantly due to oil. In fact, oil men would make deals on downtown street corners. There was a story where a guy by the name of Jim Silver Dollar, he would stand outside of his apartment and he would just throw silver dollars at everyone passing by. Astonishingly, a local businessman, in a way to motivate his daughter into losing weight, he offered her $5,000, which is around $60,000 today, for each pound that she lost. Mate, you could pay me a lot less and trust me, I would do a lot more. Now, at night, the city's elite often gathered at the Shamrock Hotel, with the Wildcatter Glenn McCarthy had opened on St. Patrick's Day the previous year. Now, a journalist reported that they came across a photo. In this photo, you see Jack and you see Candace having dinner. It looked like it was in the Cork restaurant, which is the restaurant of the hotel. Two violinists had paused to play at the table, and Jack was in a dark suit and he was holding a glass of wine. Candace was wearing a white fur wrap over a dark dress and her hair was pulled back into a chingan. I know I said that incorrectly. And etched across her face was a look of pure delight. Now, on a 3-acre plot of land in Royal Oaks, Jack built Candace a castle. This was a 3-story red brick mansion staffed with maids, cook, butlers, gardeners, handymen, and a chauffeur. In fact, Candace's personal maid was an Egyptian woman who spoke 3 languages. Adjoining the house was a 7-car garage filled with luxury automobiles. I don't even think I've ever owned 7 cars in my entire life. Candace quickly began climbing the Houston social ladder. Check after check, she would write. Alley Theatre one day, Heart Research donations the other. In this castle, that's where she threw many of her fundraisers, and most would attend just to get a glimpse of her. Who is she? Who is this Candace? She strolled from room to room in her stilettos, greeting guests with a kiss. Joan Schnitzler, she was a longtime Houston socialite. Again, what kind of title is that? But whatever. And she always wondered about Candace. None of us knew anything about her. Joan herself attended some of Candace's fundraisers with her husband. Joan said that as far as she could tell, Candace did not have a bad bone in her body. She was fun and flirty. I thought she was talking about me there for a minute. All Candace had to do was touch an old man on the arm and say, "You have a wonderful tie," and the old man would melt. Inevitably, the rumors about Candace's personal life from New Orleans made its way to Houston, and this is particularly important because you have to understand now, she has a reputation of being a rich, fun, flirty, this rather obscure woman that everybody wants to know because they know nothing about her, but for some reason everyone wants to be a part of her. But none of them knew that under the surface was essentially a farm girl. Joanne Herring, another grand dame of the city's contemporary social scene, she said that she first heard of murmurings at a dinner Candace was holding. Joanne was said one time at this dinner, one of her friends took her off to the side and the friend said, "Did you know that Candace used to be a call girl back in New Orleans?" To which Joanne responded, "Oh my God, I thought there was something different about her." Importantly though, even if these rumors were true, Candace wasn't the first young girl to marry a rich, old, wealthy man. And what's more, it was hard for the city to condemn someone whose philanthropy often went above and beyond. She volunteered at multiple hospitals. She took a special interest in the Houston Boys Club, donating $15,000 to build bathhouses for the kids at the youth center pool. See, in January 1957, Jack, he called Candace and he tells her about these local kids who are now homeless. It was said that they had become homeless because the father took the life of their mother and then stabbed the baby brother to death. So Candace boarded a flight with Jack to this family and she adopted the 4 children. This story was printed from coast to coast. In fact, one headline, it said, "Day of tragedy for children gives way to fairy tale life." When Candace walked off the plane at Houston Airport, her and Jack they were met with many photographers who wanted to take a glimpse into her new children. You had Martha, Daniel, Christopher, and Edward. This, as ever, was camera ready. She was wearing a black dress and pumps. She became one of the most famous women in town and a favorite subject of journalists. She served as a team captain for the United Fund campaign. She was chair of the prestigious Pin Oak Horse Show, which raised money for Texas Children's Hospital, and she was also a general chair of the fund drive for the Houston Opera. Candace was also an active member of the Presbyterian Church, always attending Sunday morning services. Most weeks, she brought along her children and put them in Sunday school. Indeed, there was no mother like Candace. In River Oaks, she turned the mansion's ballroom into a big giant playground. She and her chauffeur would take the children to drive-in movies, to a bowling alley, to the family's ranch, and to the Galveston Beach house. In fact, Candace and Jack, they arranged to have a baseball field built for their children and even hired a semi-professional baseball player to teach the children how to play. Imagine that. Imagine I said, Dad or wife or whoever, I want to play soccer, and they make me a soccer field. Jesus, how much money did he have? In fact, Candace even had a chimpanzee come to the house so it could play with the children. When speaking to the media, Candace said, "They're my life, my entire world." Candace went on to say that people can work hard and accomplish a lot in life, but it is useless without children to love. As the 50s came to a close, Candace seemed to have it all. Then in 1961, Candace, she receives a phone call. It's from Elizabeth Powers, who was her older sister. She said she needed help. Her 21-year-old son Mel had been thrown in jail. Raised in Alabama and Arizona, where his father operated a small commercial aviation service, Mel had been an aimless boy, expelled from school for excessive absenteeism. He later got a job going door to door selling a magazine. And during a work trip to Michigan, he persuaded an 89-year-old man to buy $20,000 of worthless stock in a fake magazine company. And because of this, Mel was convicted of fraud and sent to jail for 90 days. And this is what spurred Candace's sister to call her. The sister asked Candace when she called her, "Can Mel come and stay with you? Let him get back on his feet. Let him get back on track in life. Let him get a job." Candace said, "Of course, send him through, no problem." And when Mel showed up, he must have made an impression. And even though he had acne on his cheeks, Mel was very muscular. He had a movie star, handsome face. He was given his own bedroom, and in fact, Candace even gave him a Thunderbird to drive. Mel also underwent 4 operations at the behest of Candace. He was circumcised, he had his tonsils removed, his ears were cosmetically adjusted to lie flatter against his head, and his face was sanded. Now, I don't know what sanding your face actually does, but the fact that you gotta get your ears shrunk or connected differently, that's fucking hilarious. Now, Jack agreed to give Mel a job at one of his loan companies as a repossessor, and from the research I gathered, it turned out Mel was a fine employee. But in June 1963, about a year and a half after Mel arrived, a rumor started to spread that something was going on in the Mossler mansion. According to the gossip, Jack fired Mel, hired security guards to remove him off the estate, and had forbidden his return. That's when Jack, he left Houston and then went on to his luxury apartment in Key Biscayne. And when people asked Candace what's going on, what's happening in the mansion, she tried to save face by saying Mel got fired because he wanted to start his own business, which would have been in direct competition with Jack. I guess that's a lot easier than saying, yeah, I was smashing my nephew. When people asked Candace more questions, why is Jack not in Houston, she said he was opening up another branch in Miami, and she told everyone that everything between her and Jack was completely fine, and this was all just a big misunderstanding. And because of all this, she decided her and the children would go and visit Jack. So in June 1964, when school was done, she left for Key Biscayne. And although Candace seemed to be having fun with the children, during the day at the beach, she would be at the hospital continuously, as I mentioned previously, and she'd also bring her children along, which kind of helped ease her pain during these nagging migraines. The children later told police that they weren't bothered by their mother's exertions. She was quite a night owl. They actually liked piling into her Pontiac convertible and going for drives, and it wasn't until they returned to the apartment on June the 30th and they heard their mother's gasps that they realized something was terribly wrong. As the heiress to Jack's fortune, Candace was estimated to be worth at least $7 million and possibly much more. Today, that's actually worth $60 million. If you had $60 million, what's the first thing you'd buy? What do you think? I'd buy myself a new hairline if I'm honest. At Jack's funeral in Miami, she sat in the front row, surrounded by her children and family. Afterwards, she and the kids flew to Washington, D.C., where I am, and they buried Jack at Arlington Cemetery, which is interesting because I've gone past that cemetery many times. Meanwhile, detectives from the Dade County Sheriff's Department were following the three leads Candace had supplied that a burglar or a business rival or perhaps a lover might have done this. The detectives sensed that they had a top drawer murder mystery on their hands. This wasn't Agatha fucking Christie, you idiots. And for the police, the mystery got a bit more intriguing. See, someone told them that Jack had kicked Mel out the house after she was caught canoodling with Mel. See, the detectives learned that Mel, he arrived at Houston Airport on June the 29th. With a one-way ticket to Miami. A flight attendant confirmed that Mel, he was just carrying a briefcase as luggage. And when he arrived in Miami, he was seen in an Holiday Inn, which wasn't far from where Jack was staying. He went to the bar of the Holiday Inn many times. On his first visit, he asked for an empty glass soda bottle and left with it in his hand. And then when he returned around 1 a.m. closing time, he ordered a double scotch. And by the time Candace reported the incident to the police, Mel was already on a one-way ticket back to Houston. So you're obviously painting a picture that Mel seems like the suspect. And I think to myself, why did he purchase a one-way ticket? And maybe in his head, he wasn't sure when he would commit this act. He wasn't sure when he would encounter Jack. So maybe he thought, let me book one way now, do what I need to do. Don't know when it'll be, but I'll do what I need to do. And then when I've done the deed, I'll then book a one-way flight back. Am I right? Do you understand what I'm saying? Do you agree? And at this juncture, I also think, before I even continue the story, for me, the motivation is love. He didn't act in a loving way. And him having an affair, you could argue, is not a loving thing to do. But if Jack found out that Mel and Candace were having an affair, and Jack threatened Mel by saying, hey, continue this on, watch what happens, getting him fired and all this other stuff, then Mel probably retaliated for two reasons. One, he just grew to hate Jack, and he wanted to take what Jack had, which I don't think is the case. I think he was afraid to lose Candace. I could be wrong, but at this point, before I go further, why don't you tell me? Do you think those motivations make sense? So the detectives fly to Houston to interview Mel, and he swore that he was in Houston the whole time. He said he had gone to see a movie, although he couldn't remember the film or the theater. And if that is the case, that must have been one shit film. I mean, I can just imagine the interview must have gone like this. Mel, where the fuck were you? Officer, I was in Houston going to watch a few movies. What movie did you watch? Abba, 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 abba. And the cops were like, why don't you abba, 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 your ass in jail? He got arrested and was charged with capital murder. So while the police searched Mel's office, detectives found a photo of Mel and Candace close together at a nightclub. They also found letters, love letters from Candace, which she sent to Mel whenever she was out of town. One of the letters, it says, my darling, the image of your face is before me. I can almost feel your face against mine. I could not think of life without you. I love you. I need you. I long for you. So this is what I mean earlier when I said this was out of love. And a lot of you might think, well, no, he killed someone. This isn't love. My point is his motivations was this notion that Candace might be gone forever. So he did what he could to take the other out of the equation. Sick and twisted, I know. But to me, for some reason, it makes sense. Soon, the newspapers were starting to report that the police, they were looking into Candace to see if she was actually involved. See, at this point, the only suspect to them was Mel. If you follow the logic, one-way ticket, lied about where he was, couldn't answer what he was doing, and they knew straight away he was involved. I was speechless, and I'm not often at a loss for words. This was said by Lynn Sakowitz Wyatt, the octogenarian Houston department store heiress, who is now one of the world's most celebrated socialites, known for the soirees at her River Oaks mansion and at her home in the south of France. I remember that people came from all over just to drive past her home, hoping to get a look at her. There were literally policemen in front of her house directing traffic. But Candace, she wasn't at the mansion. Candace actually checked in to a hospital. She told doctors that she was suffering from a nervous strain. Standing outside her room were two private security guards, and she did let the press in eventually for an impromptu press conference. She was wearing a pink nightgown, and her blue eyes were swollen from crying. The press asked her, "Do you think Mel could have done this?" And she replied saying, "Oh poo." She went on to say, "That's the most ridiculous thing I've heard. If the atomic bomb was to fall, Mel would be the first person to take Jack and children out of harm's way." I'm not gonna lie, I take one look at Jack, this was a devious motherfucker. But that's purely hearsay and based on no evidence whatsoever. The press went on to ask her about this nightclub photo, and she said the idea of her and Mel having an affair was absurd, and she coined off the photo as just a night out on the town with her friends at a nightclub. The press also asked her, well, what about all these love letters? And she pawned it off again, as this is just how I speak to family and close friends. A reporter then asked her, "Do you think you're going to get arrested? Are you worried?" Candace tossed her hand over her mouth and said, her voice trembling, "How can something like this happen in this country? I don't know how they can do this. I guess some people could cast reflections on Jesus Christ himself." Candace, what the fuck are you talking about? Now, for the next year, whilst the detectives were working on the case, Candace spent much of her time with her children and their governess in Rochester, Minnesota. What a change of life. Houston, Texas, happening, popping. Key Biscayne, Miami, Florida, happening, popping. Then you end up in bonefuck, freezing tits, Minnesota. Though she did make many appointments during her time here, to fix her migraines. She stayed mostly quiet, giving only one interview to a Miami Herald investigative reporter named Gene Miller, telling him that Jacques had become unstable in the last months of his life and that he had been receiving love letters on pink stationery from a man who had also tried to blackmail him for $75,000. And that's another observation I've learned. When a partner's lover dies, right? And whenever, if in the aftermath, if a partner, husband, wife, whoever, if they start speaking ill of their partner that just died, you know that either they were involved or they are happy that they're gone. And between the two observations, the ones that speak ill of their partner once they're dead, the night or 2 nights after or 3 days or generally within that week, they were actually involved. And those who speak ill of their partner a year or so later, they probably weren't involved, but that confirms they were happy it happened. Candace insisted that she deeply loved Jack and didn't care about his money. She went on to say, "We could have lived in a phone booth. None of the money mattered to me." In June 1965, her and the children, they traveled to Arlington National Cemetery, to commemorate 1 year in the death of Jack. They knelt by Jack's grave and placed roses on his tombstone. A professional photographer hired by Candace took pictures that were sent to the wire services, along with a typed statement detailing Candace's various medical maladies. This statement claimed that the doctors told her don't travel, but she was adamant that she wanted to commemorate her husband and that Jacques Mossler, his memory is never forgotten. And at that point, it seemed like the police's investigation had stalled. But less than a month after Candace is there at Jack's grave, a Dade County grand jury indicted her and Mel, who remained in jail in Houston on capital murder charges. Prosecutors announced that Candace and her nephew Mel had plotted to take the life of Jack just a couple of years prior to when his life was taken. By the time the trial began in Miami in January 1966, more than 14 news organizations had requested seats in the courtroom. Everyone was there. Time Magazine, Life, Look, Newsweek, and the Saturday Evening Post. I wonder if True Red Crime would have got a seat. Just tell them I'll bring a great curry, huh? It was the OJ trial of its era. Really, had circumstances converged to produce such a sensational story, one that, as the Houston Chronicle put it, was teeming with love, heat, greed, savage passion, intrigue, incest, and perversion. I don't know why in all of those words, but incest was the one that made me. In some newspaper articles, there were columns. They described the trial as lubricated by sex, nourished by sex, varnished by sex. Guess you can never have enough sex. All 2 minutes of it, my personal best. Now, on the opening day of testimony, Candace arrived at the courthouse. She was wearing a white trenched coat, a white silk dress, and white pumps. And as she stepped out of her car, the press immediately gathered around her. Flash, flash, flash. Her attorney, Marion Rosen, accompanied her into the elevator to the 6th floor. And again, when they got there, whole bunch of press, whole bunch of people waiting. This was the OJ of the 1960s. The crowd was mostly women, most of whom rushed to the courthouse after they dropped the kids off to school. They gasped as Candace walked past them, and as she's walking past them, she smiled and blew them a kiss. When she entered the courtroom, she sat on the far left side of the defense counsel's table. Mel had already taken his place on the far right. The couple, they didn't look at each other at all. Mel mostly looked at the floor. One reporter observed that Mel was so big and quiet that he could play Lenny in Of Mice and Men. The lead prosecutor, Dade County State's Attorney Richard Garstein, was a tall, balding former World War II Air Force navigator who had lost his right eye after he was hit by flak during a bombing raid in Germany. Wait, how the fuck do you go from fighting the Nazis and Himmler and Hitler and all these other morons to Candace? But it was said that the reason why he wanted this case is because he wanted to win this case that would give him some kind of fame and prominency, as he wanted a career in politics. See, for Richard Garstein, as he wanted to become governor, in his head he's thinking, okay, I don't know who did this, I don't care who did this, I need to make Candace the prime suspect. Because let's assume in the end Mel is the one that's guilty and Candace isn't. Garstein still gets his conviction, but in terms of the news, the media, the world knowing, nobody's going to care about Mel. So his objective was to make Candace as guilty, or make her look as guilty as possible. He told the jury that Candace seduced Mel. She'd lied to him by telling him that she's in love with him, and then forced him to go to Miami and take the life of Jack. And this would have been perfect for her because she was at the hospital with her children at the time treating her migraines, so it was the perfect alibi. Now, I know this was the 1960s and times have changed, but that as a story seems so juvenile. I mean, maybe I'm being naive, but who the fuck? Have a look at Mel. Mel's no chump, right? He may have acted like a chump, but Mel, bro, look at the size of him. He's massive, he's huge, right? He's probably got a big pecker too, which is how he probably got Candace in the first place. Mel knows how to carry himself, I think. I could be wrong, I think. What I'm trying to tell you is, even though Mel is a fucking idiot, he doesn't seem like someone that would be like, I genuinely think what he felt and what Candace felt was real. Even though it ended in this way, it was real. I don't think Candace seduced him with the notion of wanting Jack to be dead. Garstein went on to say, Mel did the dirty work, bludgeoning Jack and stabbing him 39 times. But he was motivated by his insatiable desire for this woman. And that's what I said earlier. He was motivated by love. But although I could be wrong, it seems to me that his actions were based on impulse, impatience, immaturity, love, emotions. Basically, being a pussy. Now, the lead attorney for Candace and Mel, Percy Foreman, he was the lead attorney for Candace and Mel. He rose from his chair. A large man with slicked back hair and a ruby ring on his left hand, the 63-year-old Foreman was the most famous and flamboyant criminal defense lawyer in Houston. In the courtroom, he was a magnificent orator, and he was known for his compelling opening and closing statements. His gravelly voice, lowering dramatically, then rising as he quoted Greek poets, Roman philosophers, Shakespeare, the Bible, and Cracker Barrel proverbs. Foreman liked to boast that he acquitted over 300 people, many of those who had evidence stacked against them. In one of his most famous cases, he represented a Houston man who had shot to death his stepdaughter's teenage boyfriend in front of multiple witnesses. Foreman hurled a church pulpit into the courtroom and delivered a homily on adolescent vice, emotionally reciting a Sir Walter Scott poem about pious fathers. The man was acquitted. Regarding Foreman, you could consider him the Sonny Crockett of, defense lawyers. Wait, no, Sonny Crockett was in Miami Vice. I mean Johnny Cochran. Foreman's usual strategy was to put the victim on trial, and in this case, the victim was Jack. Standing in the center of the courtroom, he hooked his thumbs into the straps of his vest and told the jury that thousands of people hated the banker. And it's actually a pretty smart strategy, right? Nobody likes bankers. Nobody likes interest payments. Nobody likes paying money back, right? Let's be real, it's pain. There's a reason why we prefer money to leave our bank account for our rent or our mortgage. Like, imagine this. Imagine you had to take $1,000 to $3,000 out of your pocket, cold hard cash in your hands, and give it to someone. And that hurts, right? It's easier for us to pay our bills through the bank because in essence, we don't really see it. We don't really see it as if we're giving them money in real life. Nobody likes bankers. Nobody likes paying bills. Foreman, in the court case, he said, Jack was as ruthless in business as any pirate who ever sailed the seven seas. Foreman declared that a man who received so many threats against his life that he kept an axe beside his bed and frequently summoned thugs and gangsters to his home, employing them to deal with blackmailers. And like the aforementioned Johnny Cochran, there was no proof that Foreman could provide this was the case, but for Foreman, it was all about the narrative. If you can create a narrative and if you keep telling the same lies over and over again, eventually people take them as truth. So in coming up with the narrative, Foreman thought, let's use sexual fetishes. Foreman, in the court case, went on to say that Jack had every conceivable sex deviation that anybody has ever had. I'm not gonna lie, that shit's fucking funny, but kind of classless at the same time. You could stop and think, you shouldn't treat the dead like that. But for Foreman, it was all about the dub. He just needed to win by any means possible. Most notably, Foreman said that Jack had an insatiable sex appetite for high school boys and college students and met in bars frequently by the gay people. And you gotta go back to the 60s, right? If you think about it, now in today's world, when it comes to LGBT, we're all opening and accepting, and let's be fair, nobody really cares, right? If you wanna be homosexual or whatever, no problem. But back then, the social stigma was a lot worse. And if you're in a court case, and if you say he loved schoolboys, and if you say he would parole the streets for gay sex, it had a more vulgar meaning. So you see the kind of picture that Foreman was trying to portray. Foreman said that if each of the 39 wounds on the body of the deceased had been inflicted by a separate person, that is, 39 different people, there still would be 3 times as many people in the state of Florida with enough reason to want the death of Jacques Mossler. That's a pretty powerful statement. It's also important to understand that it wasn't all male jury. That may not mean much today, but back then, the culture was a little different. The jury included a marine specimen collector at the Miami Seaquarium, a bus driver, a mail carrier, a bellhop, a former proprietor of a rooming house, a piano player, and a man one of the Houston newspapers described as a truck driver of the Jewish faith. So in other words, a myriad of different people. While Foreman sat down, the jury, they kept looking at Candace, observing her, and she was teary-eyed and she was being consoled by Rosen. In terms of Candace, she wore a gold necklace around her neck. Now, she went on to say that this was given to her by Jack, and it could easily be inferred that she wore this on purpose to give the illusion that she's paying homage to Jack. Rosen did say, after about that time, that the jury just could not take her eyes off Candace. There were some courtroom observers who later said they believed the trial was over the moment Candace took a seat in the courtroom and crossed her legs. The press corps was certainly taken by her. In fact, during the breaks of the court case, she'd be sitting there chin-wagging away with the press. She even met up with a few of them at night, having dinner, having drinks, chilling. Jack's sexuality was a constant theme in Foreman's defense. He insinuated that Jack had a sexual relationship with the former vice president of one of his companies. He called to the stand a former handyman of the Mosslers who testified that he had seen the banker with 3 shirtless young men in a trailer at the Mosslers' Galveston Beach property. Jack and the other men were drinking from a bottle of liquor and they talked real fancy, said the handyman. Gerstein and his assistant prosecutors fired right back, characterizing Candace as a dangerous adulterer capable of seducing and destroying anyone who dared to get involved with her. The prosecutors called a string of witnesses who described Candace's sexual desires as depraved. And I wonder how I would describe my sexual desires. Short and sweet. A few testified that they saw Candace and Mel, canoodling, hugging each other, holding each other's arms. One of the witnesses said that these two were too passionate, despite being relatives. A man testified that he saw Mel and Candace kiss. Another man also testified that he saw Mel and Candace go into one of their trailers and start hugging in bed. In fact, one of Mel's co-workers, who also testified, he said that Mel had told him that Mel could get anything he wants from Candace so long as he gave her oral sex. Now, according to reporters, when a lot of these allegations by witnesses were said, Candace kept a stony face, but Mel, he kept smiling. And I'm guessing in his head he's thinking, yeah, those times were good. Now, as the trial went on, Gerstein, he found it hard to link Candace to the murder as he didn't have a murder weapon. He also didn't have any eyewitnesses that put Candace at the scene of the crime at the time. A fingerprint expert did testify that Mel's palm print was identified on the kitchen counter in Jack's apartment, but there was no way to say for certain when Mel had left the print. But Gerstein, he had one more card to play. He claimed in the court case that there were several people who said Mel and Candace approached him to take the life of Jack, essentially trying to hire a hitman. One of these men, he worked at a gas station, and he claimed that Mel and Candace approached him and said, take the life of Jack, drive to Mexico and leave his body there. And then there was Billy Frank Mulvey, a self-acknowledged thief and dope addict, who testified he got a call from Candace asking him to meet her at a Houston beer joint called the 24-Hour Club. According to Mulvey's testimony, Candace said that she heard about him when she too herself served a small time in jail years ago. Mulvey said that he told Candace, I'll do it for $25,000. His plan was to rig dynamite to Jack's car, but he was arrested and thrown into the Harris County jail on another charge before he got around to doing it. In 1964, he continued, he was still in jail when Mel was arrested for Jack's murder. Them two shared a cell, and Mel confessed to him that he did it. At one point, whilst Mulvey is giving his testimony, Candace gets out of her chair and she says, I've never seen this man before in my life. And like Candace, a lot of the reporters in the building weren't buying Mulvey's story. In fact, the press were actually skeptical of all the alleged hitmen, describing them as shameless and outright rascals, nitwits who had willingly committed perjury in hopes of getting a reduced prison sentence or at least a free trip to Florida where they could sunbathe on the beach before coming to court to testify. So on March the 3rd, both sides rested and closing arguments began. During his 62-minute summation, Gerstein lit into Candace again, calling her the mastermind and manipulator of this entire scheme. Gerstein said that the only way that Candace could get a hold of Jack's fortune was to eliminate him from this earth. But Gerstein couldn't compete with Foreman's oratorical brilliance. The defense attorney began his final argument by saying, I will now make a few brief remarks. He then went on to speak for 5 hours with 3 intermissions. He quoted Shakespeare, Wordsworth, H.G. Wells, Buddha, and Jesus. I guess if that was today, it'd be Tupac, it'd be Drake, it'd be Dr. Dre, Lil Wayne. He referred to Mel as that innocent boy and to Candace as that sweet little woman. And in a surprise move, he went after the Dade County Sheriff's detectives. He claimed that without any evidence, the detectives made deals with Jack's daughters from his previous marriage. See, Foreman said that the detectives had agreed to manufacture testimony against Candace and Mel in return for a large under-the-table payment from the daughters, who wanted Candace convicted so they can inherit Jack's money themselves. Now, whether the jury believe him or not, his tactics are genius. And as Foreman came to the end of his speech, he told the jury to look at Candace, who at this point was holding a bouquet of flowers. Let him among you without sin cast the first stone. That's what Foreman said, and then he sat down. And after 3 days of deliberation, the jury came back with a verdict. Candace was dressed in a beige suit and a white coat with gloves and sunglasses. Mel, who was wearing an olive green suit, kept looking at the floor. When the jury came back with the verdict that Mel and Candace were not guilty, Mel just looked in front and he said, "Beautiful." Now in October 1976, Candace, she flew from Houston to Miami to attend a board of directors meeting. She checked into a suite at the Fontainebleau Hotel and called her Miami doctor, telling him she had a violent headache. He came to the hotel and he injected her with Demerol, which was a painkiller, and Phenergan, a sedative. Apparently, the doctor wasn't aware that Candace had already ingested tablets of Placidil, a barbiturate designed to treat insomnia. Her secretary found her the next morning. A coroner ruled that she died from an overdose. Candace was 62 years old. So to conclude on the court case, I think it's pretty clear that Mel and Candace, I don't know what kind of punishment Candace should have gotten because she wasn't there at the time. The current Lincoln murder weapon, Mel certainly did it though. Like, irrespective of how good Foreman was in the court case, and fair play to the lad, right? He had a job to do, he got it done by any means. But I think Mel acted in love for Candace. But that's the story of Candace and Jacques Mossler. Why don't you guys comment? Tell me what you think.